George Washington entered the world on February 22, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Virginia, not as a nobleman or a prince, but as a child of the colonial frontier, a world balanced between opportunity and uncertainty. The Washingtons belonged to the middling gentry, respected landowners, but far from the grandeur of the English aristocracy whose customs still dominated colonial life. George's father, Augustine Washington, owned tobacco plantations, ironworks, and wide stretches of fertile land. His industry and ambition secured the family a comfortable life, yet this comfort rested on a fragile foundation. The volatility of tobacco prices, the dangers of frontier living, and dependence on enslaved labor. George grew up surrounded by fields of tobacco, small villages, and endless forests stretching toward an unknown west. Ships loaded with iron and tobacco sailed from nearby rivers toward England, powerful reminders that Virginia, despite its growing prosperity, was merely an outpost of the British Empire. As a child, George could hardly imagine he would one day lead a rebellion against the very empire that shaped his earliest years. His upbringing was unsettled. Augustine's constant business expansions meant the family moved frequently, first to Little Hunting Creek on the Potomac River and later to Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg. These relocations tore George away from friends, stability, and any sense of a permanent home. Life in the colonies was full of motion, both physical and social, and Washington absorbed early the idea that a man must adapt to survive. The death of Augustine in 1743 changed everything. George was only 11. His inheritance, the Ferry Farm estate, did not come with the independence a young boy might imagine. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, controlled the property. Mary was stern, demanding, and deeply protective. Their relationship would remain strained for most of George's life. He addressed her formally in letters, honored Madam, never Mother. Her strictness forged in him a sense of emotional distance, a stoic self-control that would later define his leadership, but it also pushed him to seek affection and mentorship elsewhere. He found that in his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, 14 years older, educated in England, and a veteran of the War of Jenkins' Ear, Lawrence embodied everything young George admired: confidence, honor, discipline, and accomplishment. When he told stories of serving under Admiral Edward Vernon and the harrowing expedition to Cartagena, George listened with awe. These tales painted the military not merely as a profession, but as a proving ground for character. Lawrence became George's lifelong model of manhood. Lawrence's home, Mount Vernon, named in honor of his former commander, became a second home to George. Whenever tension with his mother grew, George escaped to Mount Vernon's halls, its refined gatherings, and its vision of what a gentleman's life could be. It was here he discovered the world he wanted to inhabit, yet he lacked the education typical of that world. Unlike Lawrence, who had studied classical languages and literature, George received only basic schooling: arithmetic, reading, writing, and a bit of geography. The Washington family's finances, stretched by the needs of many children, could not support an elite education abroad. George compensated with relentless self-study. He read books on history, philosophy, and conduct. He copied by hand the rules of civility and decent behavior, internalizing ideals of restraint, honor, and discipline. These rules would later shape his famously reserved and composed demeanor. It was during his teenage years that he discovered his first real talent: surveying. The frontier was rapidly expanding westward, and surveyors were in high demand. George possessed a natural eye for landscapes, symmetry, and order. In the wilderness, he found both freedom and purpose. At just 16, he joined an expedition with the powerful Fairfax family, mapping land west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Through rain-soaked forests, over rugged hills, and across untamed rivers, Washington learned not only how to measure land, but how to measure himself against nature's hardships. By 17, he had his own surveying license and began earning money, saving diligently, and investing in land. Before he turned 20, he owned more than 2,000 acres. These early years taught him independence, resilience, and the practical knowledge of terrain that would later become invaluable on the battlefield. Still, he longed for military glory. Under Lawrence's influence, George's dream of joining the Royal Navy grew stronger. A naval commission promised honor, structure, and a path toward distinction. The Fairfax family supported the plan. Lawrence supported it. Even the officers George met during his surveying trips encouraged it. But Mary Ball Washington did not. She saw the Navy as a harsh life of discipline, danger, and low pay, and perhaps feared losing her eldest son's labor and loyalty. She refused to grant permission. The opportunity vanished. It was one of George's earliest bitter disappointments. Yet the blockage of one path opened another. His surveying career flourished, his reputation grew, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, the foundations of a leader were forming. Discipline forged by strict upbringing, ambition inspired by Lawrence, independence shaped by the frontier, and a hunger for honor that the Navy could not extinguish. By the early 1750s, George Washington stood on the threshold of adulthood, a tall, athletic young man with a commanding presence, restless ambition, and a deep desire to prove himself. He did not yet know that the greatest empire on earth and the wildest frontiers of America would soon collide, and that he, barely in his 20s, would be thrust into the center of that collision. The world was changing, and George Washington was about to change with it. When George Washington entered his early 20s, the quiet life of surveying and plantation work could no longer contain the restlessness that had been building inside him since childhood. The frontier was tightening like a coil, and tension between Britain and France was rising in the vast, disputed wilderness known as the Ohio Country. For Washington, this conflict represented more than imperial rivalry. It was an opening, a chance to break free from the constraints of his colonial birth, a chance to prove himself in the arena that had shaped his heroes. He had land, ambition, discipline, and a thirst for honor. What he lacked was opportunity. Now, opportunity was coming directly toward him. In 1753, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, needed a man of courage and stamina to deliver a message deep into the wilderness. The French had begun building forts in territory claimed by the British, and Dinwiddie needed someone to confront them, assess their strength, and return with intelligence. Few men were willing to march hundreds of miles through frozen rivers, snow-choked forests, and hostile territory. Even fewer could count on the trust of powerful colonial families. Washington, tall, composed, and already known for his frontier experience, was chosen. He set out in late autumn with a small party, pushing through the Allegheny Mountains as winter descended. They trekked across icy rivers, slept in the snow, and encountered Native American leaders who were themselves navigating the tightening pressure between British promises and French encroachment. Washington observed everything. He took notes with the discipline of a student and the precision of a surveyor. He measured routes, counted soldiers, mapped terrain, and assessed fortifications. When he finally reached the French commander, he delivered Dinwiddie's message: "Withdraw peacefully." The French commander politely refused. The two empires were on a collision course. Washington's return journey was more dangerous than the first. At one point, a native guide fired at him at close range. The bullet missed. Washington fought his way back through storm and ice and reached Williamsburg with a report that immediately traveled across the Atlantic. His journal was published in London, turning him into a minor celebrity overnight. The boy from the Virginia frontier had caught the attention of the British Empire, but the fame didn't fill Washington with pride. Instead, it hardened his resolve. The French were strengthening their position. War was inevitable. And if war was coming, George Washington was determined to be part of it. In 1754, Dinwiddie promoted him to lieutenant colonel and placed him in command of a small regiment sent to secure the forks of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet. Washington marched into the wilderness again, only to discover that the French had already seized the position and renamed it Fort Duquesne. Tensions escalated rapidly. Washington's men encountered a French scouting party in a ravine. A brief firefight erupted. The French surrendered, and then chaos followed. A native ally, the warrior Tanacharison, killed a French officer who was carrying a diplomatic message. Washington had not ordered the killing, but he could not prevent it either. The event ignited international fury. Paris accused him of assassination. London questioned colonial judgment. Washington, barely 22, was suddenly at the center of a diplomatic storm. Knowing retaliation would come, he hastily built a crude defensive position he named Fort Necessity, a name that would become bitterly ironic. The fort sat in a vulnerable meadow surrounded by forest and high ground, the worst possible choice for defense. Washington's native allies warned him, begged him to retreat. He refused. Confidence, ambition, and inexperience combined to cloud his judgment. The French attack came with brutal clarity. Rain poured down, soaking the gunpowder. Sharpshooters fired from the trees. Mud filled the trenches. By nightfall, a third of Washington's men were dead or wounded. Surrounded and outmatched, he surrendered, the only surrender of his military career. The humiliation was complete. His signed capitulation, written in French he could not read, falsely claimed responsibility for assassination. His reputation, so suddenly illuminated, dimmed just as quickly. But Washington did not retreat into shame. He devoured the experience instead, analyzing every mistake, absorbing every lesson. He learned the cost of poor terrain, the power of mobility, and the consequences of ignoring allies. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that military leadership demanded more than bravery. It demanded wisdom. In 1755, he sought redemption. When General Edward Braddock arrived from Britain with 2,000 experienced soldiers to launch a full-scale assault on Fort Duquesne, Washington volunteered as aide-de-camp. Braddock distrusted colonial officers, but Washington's determination impressed him. They marched west through thick forests, cutting a road as they went, a slow, grinding effort that exposed them to ambush. Washington advised Braddock to travel lightly, to move like the native warriors and French irregulars who knew the terrain. Braddock ignored him. On July 9th, the army walked straight into a coordinated French and native attack. Musket smoke filled the forest. Warriors fired from behind trees, unseen and unreachable. British regulars, trained for open field battles, fell into confusion. Officers dropped one by one. Amid the chaos, Washington rode across the battlefield with astonishing composure, delivering orders under fire. 2 horses were shot out from under him. 4 bullets passed through his coat. Yet he remained untouched, as if destiny itself refused to let him fall. Braddock was mortally wounded. Washington led the shattered remnants of the army back to safety. Though the campaign was a disaster, his courage became legendary throughout the colonies. Pastors preached sermons about divine protection. Soldiers whispered that he could not be killed. Even enemy warriors remarked on the young Virginian who rode fearlessly through gunfire. In the aftermath, Washington was promoted to commander of all Virginia forces, a monumental responsibility for a man barely in his mid-20s. But the glory he longed for did not come. Instead, he found frustration, undermanned regiments, desertion, constant raids, and a British command that refused to grant him a royal commission. Washington, who dreamed of honor, now confronted the limits placed on colonial-born officers. He wrote bitter letters, venting his humiliation at being treated as inferior despite bearing the full weight of Virginia's defense. The war dragged on. Washington fell ill from exhaustion and was forced to return home. Yet even during illness, his path shifted in a new direction. He met Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with grace, warmth, and a quiet strength that complemented his own reserve. They married in 1759. With Martha came not only companionship, but stability, wealth, and social standing. Mount Vernon became his permanent home, a place he would reshape into a symbol of his identity. Though his dream of a British military career had been denied, Washington had transformed. He was no longer the naive young officer who had built Fort Necessity. He was a seasoned veteran, a man who had seen defeat and fought through fire. He had learned the power of discipline, the value of alliances, and the heavy burdens of command. He had learned that the empire he wished to serve would never fully accept him. And somewhere within him, quietly, the seed of resentment began to grow, a seed that, in time, would bloom into revolution. After the French and Indian War ended, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon believing his days of military service were behind him. He was 27, a war-hardened officer, newly married, and eager to build a prosperous estate worthy of the gentleman he aspired to become. Yet peace did not bring him the stability he expected. Instead, it unveiled the tensions, injustices, and contradictions of life under British rule. Tensions that would slowly transform him from a loyal colonial officer into one of the most determined voices for American resistance. Mount Vernon became Washington's laboratory for ambition. He expanded the mansion, experimented with new crops, and managed a growing workforce of enslaved laborers with a strict but increasingly analytical eye. Tobacco, the backbone of Virginia's economy, proved unreliable and exhausting to the soil. Worse, it tied Washington to British merchants who controlled prices and extended credit at crushing interest rates. No matter how much he produced, he remained trapped in a cycle of debt to London. Every shipment of tobacco reminded him that even wealthy planters were not masters of their fate. They were subjects of distant creditors and the crown. This economic frustration shaped Washington's political awakening far more than fiery speeches or ideological arguments. He wasn't a philosopher or a theorist like Jefferson. He didn't draw inspiration from ancient republics like Adams. Washington's path to revolution began with the grinding reality of daily life: unfair taxes, unreliable markets, and a sense that colonial success never translated into colonial respect. As the 1760s unfolded, Britain began imposing new taxes to pay for the massive debt it had accumulated during the 7 Years' War. Parliament believed the colonies should help cover the cost of their own defense. The colonists believed they should not be taxed by a government in which they had no representation. Washington had fought and nearly died in service to the British Empire. Now that same empire insisted on taxing him without asking his consent. The Stamp Act of 1765 hit him first. It placed taxes on all printed materials, deeds, newspapers, legal documents. Washington, a landowner and politician, needed these documents constantly. The tax wasn't just expensive, it felt insulting. Private correspondence shows him simmering with resentment, calling the act unconstitutional. But Washington was still cautious. He did not yet talk about rebellion. Instead, he supported legal protest and unified action through the Virginia House of Burgesses. When the Stamp Act was repealed a year later, Washington hoped the conflict might fade. Instead, Britain doubled down. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed new duties on imported goods: paper, lead, glass, paint, and tea. These items were essential for plantation life. Once again, Washington's ledger tightened. Once again, he felt the weight of decisions made across the ocean by people who knew nothing of life in Virginia. This time, Washington's response was stronger. He joined the movement to boycott British goods and reduce dependence on imports. He began shifting Mount Vernon away from tobacco and toward wheat, corn, and diversified production, a step that both freed him from British merchants and strengthened the colony's economic independence. For Washington, self-sufficiency became both a personal and political calling. By 1769, his private frustrations had sharpened into a public stance. Alongside his friend and neighbor George Mason, Washington helped craft the Fairfax Resolves, a bold declaration asserting that taxation without representation violated the natural rights of the colonists. The resolves condemned British economic policies and insisted the colonies had the right to govern themselves in all matters of domestic concern. Washington's language was still moderate, but his intent was unmistakable. The colonies had reached a breaking point. When the royal governor dissolved the House of Burgesses in retaliation, Washington did not retreat. He and his fellow Burgesses reconvened at a local tavern, continuing their work outside official authority. It was a symbolic moment, the first time Washington openly defied the British government. What began as economic frustration was evolving into a moral and political conviction. Then came the spark that ignited the colonies, the Boston Tea Party in December 1773. Washington was not in favor of destroying private property, but he was even more outraged by Britain's response. The intolerable acts, especially the closure of Boston's port, convinced him that the Crown intended not just to regulate the colonies, but to crush them. "Boston attacked," he wrote, "is the cause of America." In that single sentence, Washington crossed an invisible threshold. He no longer saw these conflicts as isolated disputes over policy. He saw a struggle for the rights of all Americans. His loyalty was shifting. The empire that once represented honor and opportunity now represented oppression. By the summer of 1774, Washington's reputation for calm leadership, military experience, and personal integrity made him an obvious delegate to the First Continental Congress. In Philadelphia, alongside Adams, Patrick Henry, and other rising figures, he spoke rarely but carried enormous influence. His presence suggested unity between radical New England patriots and more cautious Southern planters. Every man there knew war was likely. Every man also knew that if war came, they would need someone who understood command, discipline, and sacrifice. Many whispered that Washington was that man. When Washington returned to Virginia after Congress adjourned, he was no longer simply a planter, a veteran, or a local politician. He had become something entirely different, a symbol of colonial unity, a leader who could bridge regional divides, and a man willing to risk reputation, wealth, and life itself for a cause larger than his own. His transformation was not dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, shaped by years of quiet frustration, growing principle, and a deepening understanding that the British Empire, once the world he wanted to serve, no longer saw the colonists as partners, but as subjects to be controlled. The seeds of revolution had taken root. The conflict that would define Washington's destiny was drawing near, and soon the colonies would look to him to lead them through the greatest struggle of their age. By the spring of 1775, the colonies stood on the edge of an abyss. Skirmishes at Lexington and Concord ignited the first sparks of war, and within weeks a siege had formed around Boston. As delegates of the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia, armed conflict was no longer a theoretical fear. It was a living reality. The colonies needed an army, a leader, and a unified purpose. And though he did not ask for the role, George Washington walked into Congress wearing his old blue and buff militia uniform, an unspoken signal that he was ready if called upon. On June 15, 1775, Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington accepted with solemn humility, saying he did not believe himself equal to the task. But privately, he knew there was no turning back. The destiny he had tried to avoid, the military career denied to him by the British, now returned in a form he could never have imagined. This time, he would not serve the empire. He would fight it. When Washington arrived outside Boston, he found not an army, but a restless collection of militia companies. Brave but disorganized, poorly supplied, and dangerously inexperienced. Men slept in makeshift huts, discipline was inconsistent, and hygiene was so poor that disease claimed more soldiers than battle. Many enlisted for a year at most, forcing Washington to rebuild his ranks constantly. Supplies were scarce, powder and muskets almost non-existent. Congress, inexperienced and cautious, moved slowly. Yet Washington did not yield to despair. His strength was not genius, but unshakable resolve. He enforced discipline, established clear chains of command, and worked tirelessly to impose a sense of national identity on men who still saw themselves as Virginians, Pennsylvanians, or New Englanders first. The Battle of Bunker Hill had shown the British that American militia could fight fiercely. Washington's mission was to turn that raw courage into a sustained force capable of defending a revolution. The winter of 1775-1776 tested him like nothing before. Snow blanketed the camps around Boston, morale plummeted, and supplies dwindled. Many doubted the cause, but Washington refused to relinquish hope. When Henry Knox, the young bookseller turned artillery officer, arrived in January after hauling 60 massive cannons over frozen lakes and mountains from Fort Ticonderoga, Washington saw his chance. In a daring overnight operation, he positioned the artillery atop Dorchester Heights, overlooking the British in Boston. With one brilliant move, he forced them to evacuate without a single Continental casualty. The victory lifted spirits across the colonies, but the true test was still ahead. Washington knew that the British would return with a far stronger force. New York, with its deep harbor and strategic location, was the likely target. He rushed his army south, fortified Manhattan and Brooklyn, and prepared to face one of the most powerful military machines on Earth. In the summer of 1776, the British arrived exactly as expected, not with a strike, but with a storm. Over 30,000 soldiers and sailors, commanded by General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe, filled the waters around New York. The largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled landed on American shores. Washington had roughly half that number, many of them untested recruits. The first major battle came on Long Island in August. Outmaneuvered and outflanked, Washington's defenses collapsed. More than 1,000 Americans were killed or captured. Yet in the face of catastrophe, Washington's leadership shone. He orchestrated a miraculous nighttime retreat across the East River, ferrying his entire army away under cover of fog so thick the British never saw them leave. Had the retreat failed, the revolution might have died that night. But defeat continued to haunt him. The British forced him from Manhattan, from Harlem Heights, from Fort Washington, and across New Jersey. Supplies vanished, morale shattered, desertion surged, Congress fled Philadelphia in panic. Newspapers whispered that Washington was unfit for command. Even his own generals conspired behind his back. By December 1776, Washington commanded barely 3,000 ragged men. The revolution hung by a thread. It was then that he revealed the true nature of his character. Rather than withdraw or surrender, Washington planned an audacious strike, one of the boldest in military history. On Christmas night, as freezing rain and snow whipped across the Delaware River, he led his exhausted troops in a nighttime crossing to surprise a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton. The river was clogged with ice. Men marched barefoot. Cannon wheels froze. Yet Washington pressed forward, silent and determined. At dawn, they struck. The Hessians, expecting nothing, were overwhelmed. The Americans captured nearly 1,000 prisoners while losing almost none of their own. Trenton was not merely a military victory, it was a resurrection. Within days, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating another British detachment. These triumphs reinvigorated the colonies, restored faith in the army, and transformed Washington from a commander retreating through wilderness into a symbol of American perseverance. But the war would not relent. In 1777, the British seized Philadelphia after defeating Washington at Brandywine and Germantown. Once again, his strategic flaws were exposed. His tendency to rely on frontal assaults, his misjudgment of terrain, his occasional inability to adapt quickly. Yet his resilience remained unbroken. As winter closed in, he led his army to Valley Forge. Valley Forge became the crucible of the Revolution. Men starved, shivered, and died from disease. There were no shoes, no blankets, and at times no meat or bread for days. Congress had little money, and the states often ignored requests for supplies. The army teetered on the edge of collapse. But Washington held it together through sheer force of will. He rode out daily to inspect the troops, encouraged officers, begged Congress for resources, and maintained the belief that the cause was worth every hardship. His wife Martha arrived to nurse the sick, sew clothes, and bring a sense of humanity to the camp. And then came Baron von Steuben, the Prussian officer whose training transformed the Continental Army into a disciplined, unified force capable of standing against British regulars. By spring, the army that marched out of Valley Forge was no longer a desperate collection of militiamen, but a professional fighting force. And Washington, tempered by failure but unbroken, stood ready to lead them into the next decisive phase of the war. The revolution had not yet been won, but Washington had become the indispensable man who would carry it forward no matter the cost. When George Washington marched his army out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778, he was no longer the inexperienced commander who had been driven from New York or humbled on the fields of Brandywine. He had become something rarer, a leader forged through suffering, through humiliation, and through the unwavering loyalty of men who believed in him even when victory appeared impossible. But the war was far from over, and the obstacles he would face in the final years, and afterward, in peace, would test him in ways no battlefield ever could. The entry of France into the war transformed everything. Where Washington once struggled alone against the greatest empire on earth, he now commanded an alliance with a navy, foreign officers, and the backing of a major European power. But alliances, like armies, were fragile. French generals often ignored his directives, viewing American officers as amateurs. French diplomats pursued their own interests first and the revolution second. Washington had to walk a careful line, grateful yet wary, respectful yet firm. The war for independence had become international, but Washington knew it could be lost with a single misstep. In 1779 and 1780, the focus of British strategy shifted south. They seized Savannah and Charleston, then swept inland, crushing American armies along the way. The South burned with the fires of occupation, rebellion, and retribution. Washington could not be everywhere at once. He depended on his generals to hold the line, but some failed him. The greatest blow came not from the British, but from within. Benedict Arnold, once Washington's favorite officer, the hero of Saratoga, brave to the point of recklessness, betrayed the cause. Driven by bitterness over perceived slights and seduced by British gold, Arnold conspired to surrender West Point, one of the most important fortresses in America. The plot was uncovered at the last moment. Arnold escaped, but the betrayal cut Washington deeply. He did not rage, did not curse. He simply stared into the distance and said quietly, "Whom can we trust now?" The war had taken many things from him: men, battles, resources. But this wound struck closest to his heart. Meanwhile, the British general Charles Cornwallis moved into Virginia, threatening the very state Washington called home. Farms burned, towns fell. Even Mount Vernon narrowly escaped destruction. Washington feared for his land, his family, and everything he had built. Yet he refused to abandon the larger vision. The war was bigger than him, bigger than Virginia, bigger than any colony. It was a struggle for a nation that did not yet fully exist. In 1781, the turning point finally arrived. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed to the Chesapeake instead of New York, an unexpected stroke of luck. Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, believing the British Navy would protect him. Instead, Washington saw the opportunity of a lifetime. Working with the French General Rochambeau, he executed a masterful deception. He marched his army south while making the British believe he was preparing to attack New York. By the time Cornwallis realized the truth, Washington and the French had surrounded him on land and sea. The siege of Yorktown was relentless. Artillery thundered day and night. Trenches crept closer and closer to the British defenses. On October 14th, American and French troops stormed two critical redoubts, clearing the final path to Cornwallis's lines. The assault was fierce, bloody, and personal. One of the bayonet charges was led by Washington's adopted son, the Marquis de Lafayette. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The news echoed across the world. Bells rang in Philadelphia. Crowds cheered in Paris. Even in London, Prime Minister Lord North collapsed into his chair and exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." The war would drag on for 2 more years, but Yorktown marked its true end. The British sought peace. The United States of America, once a dream whispered in taverns and debated in secret meetings, was now a sovereign nation. Washington could have taken the spoils of victory. He commanded the only standing army in the country. Many feared he would seize power, crown himself, or at least rule like Cromwell. Instead, he stunned the world. In December 1783 in Annapolis, he resigned his commission, handing power back to Congress. The moment was so powerful, so unexpected, that King George III reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington did, and he walked away. But peace brought new problems. The nation he had fought to create was fragile, disorganized, and nearly bankrupt. The Articles of Confederation gave the federal government almost no power. States bickered, refused to pay taxes, raised their own armies, and flirted with chaos. Farmers rebelled in Massachusetts. Merchants panicked in Boston. The young republic seemed on the verge of collapse. Washington, retired at Mount Vernon, watched with growing alarm. He had hoped never to return to public life. War had exhausted him. Losses had aged him. But he also understood something few others did. The revolution could still fail. Independence was not security. Liberty was not stability. A nation could win a war and still lose the peace. In 1787, when leaders gathered in Philadelphia to fix the Articles of Confederation, they asked Washington to preside. His presence alone granted legitimacy, unity, and discipline to the proceedings. He rarely spoke, but when he did, the room listened. Under his steady influence, the delegates crafted a new constitution, a stronger federal government, a balanced structure of powers, and the promise of a republic capable of surviving beyond a single generation. Everyone knew who the first president would be. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. No one else in American history has been chosen without a single dissenting vote. Yet even as he accepted the office, he confessed privately that he felt like a culprit going to the place of execution. The task ahead was immense. The government barely existed. There were no federal courts, no executive agencies, no precedents, and no roadmap. Everything, every step, every decision would define what the presidency would become. Washington approached the role with a seriousness that no monarch could surpass. He established rituals that balanced authority with humility, creating a government neither royal nor revolutionary, but uniquely American. His cabinet, Hamilton, Jefferson, Knox, and Randolph, became the model for all future administrations. Under his leadership, the Bill of Rights was adopted, the National Bank was created, and the new capital city, Washington, D.C., began to rise from the banks of the Potomac. But his presidency was not peaceful. It was torn by factionalism, political feuds, and the clashing visions of Hamilton and Jefferson. Washington, who despised partisanship, watched with sorrow as parties formed around him. Newspapers attacked him. Critics accused him of monarchical tendencies. Foreign wars threatened to pull the young nation into conflict. Britain seized American ships. France demanded loyalty. Washington held firm, declaring neutrality and steering the country away from entangling alliances. By the end of his second term, he was exhausted. Age weighed heavily on him. His hands trembled. His patience thinned. And the nation he once unified now stood deeply divided. Yet Washington understood that his final act would be as important as his first. If he stepped down willingly, he would set a precedent for peaceful transfer of power, something the world had rarely seen. In 1796, he announced he would not seek a third term. His farewell address, crafted with Hamilton's help, warned against political parties, foreign entanglements, and regional divisions. It remains one of the most important documents in American history. He returned to Mount Vernon once more, hoping to spend the rest of his life as a private citizen, farming the land he loved. Yet fate did not grant him many years. On December 12, 1799, after riding through freezing rain to inspect his property, Washington fell ill. 2 days later, surrounded by Martha and a handful of close friends, he spoke his final words, "'Tis well." He died calmly, as he had lived, with dignity. His death triggered a wave of mourning across the nation and even in Europe. Napoleon ordered 10 days of mourning in France. Tributes poured in from around the world. For the first time, Americans understood the true weight of what they had lost. Washington had not simply led an army or presided over a nation. He had shaped the very principles by which the republic would endure. He was not perfect. He made mistakes on battlefields. He owned enslaved people. He struggled with contradictions of his time. But he was undeniably the indispensable figure of the American founding, the one man whose restraint, humility, and unwavering devotion to the common good prevented the revolution from devouring itself. He won a war without seeking power. He wielded authority without abusing it. He held a nation together when it might have broken apart. And when it was time to relinquish control, he did so willingly and forever. In the end, George Washington's greatest achievement was not victory on the battlefield or success in office. It was the example he set, a leader who chose character over ambition, duty over glory, and unity over division. His legacy lives not only in monuments or titles, but in the nation he helped build, a nation he trusted to survive without him. From the quiet banks of the Potomac to the halls of power he shaped, the story of George Washington remains the story of America itself, fragile, determined, imperfect, and, against all odds, enduring.